On a frozen harbor in Michigan, a ruined veteran slept inside an old silver RV with only one friend left beside him. Bishop, his scarred German shepherd, never spoke, but he always knew when Jonah was slipping too far into the past. Then Jonah bought a broken winter inn on a limestone bluff, hoping only to sell the land and survive another season. But beneath its stained glass, old floors, and sleeping rooms, the larkspur was hiding something that did not belong to history. A clean offer, an old betrayal, and a secret tied beneath the snow would force Jonah to choose what kind of man he still was. This is a story about loyalty, loss, and the quiet miracle of finding a purpose after everything seems gone. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, please like and subscribe to help us reach 5,000 subscribers and keep these stories coming. By the time the sun rose over Morro Bay, the world had already been polished white. Snow lay over the docks in soft, careful layers. It filled the seams between the old planks, rounded the rusted cleats, and turned every coil of rope into something gentle and sleeping. Lake Superior stretched beyond the harbor like a sheet of blue steel under glass, its surface broken here and there by dark water, where the wind refused to let ice settle. The town itself looked almost cheerful, though Jonah Bellamy knew better than to trust cheerfulness in February. Red-roofed houses climbed the low hill above the marina. A bakery window glowed amber on Cedar Street. The gas station sign flickered beside the road, stubborn as an old lighthouse that had misplaced the sea. Along the harbor, yellow street lamps still burned in the morning light, their halos fading slowly as if reluctant to surrender their small watch. At the far edge of the marina lot, where the snowplow always seemed to forget its last pass, an aging silver RV sat with one tire half buried and a blue tarp tied over a roof seam. It leaned a little to the right, not dramatically, just enough to suggest it had opinions about gravity. Inside, Jonah Bellamy woke with a hand on his chest. For one breathless second, he did not know where he was. Then he felt the weight again. Warm, steady, familiar. Bishop's head rested across him like a living sandbag, heavy enough to hold a man to earth. The German shepherd did not bark. He did not paw. He simply waited, amber-brown eyes watching Jonah through the dim light of the RV, as if the dog had been assigned by some ancient winter god to make sure one stubborn human did not drift too far into old storms. Jonah exhaled. "All right," he murmured, voice rough from sleep. "I'm here." Bishop blinked once. "You're getting bossy in retirement." The dog's right ear, the one that drooped slightly at the tip when he was tired, gave a faint twitch. His left ear remained upright and noble, like a flag that refused to come down. Jonah sat up slowly, joints protesting in quiet, unmusical ways. At 52, he was still built like a man who had once trusted his body with dangerous work, tall, broad-shouldered, thick through the chest and arms. But life had sanded him down in places no gym could restore. There were lines beside his gray-blue eyes from years of glare off cloud and water. His brown hair, gone ash-gray at the temples, stuck up in the cold. A short beard shadowed his jaw, more neglect than style. He pulled on an old army green t-shirt, then his red and black flannel jacket, the collar soft from wear and the cuffs frayed pale at the edges. The shirt had belonged to a better time, or at least a time with regular laundry and a working thermostat. His cargo pants were faded olive, patched at one knee. His boots waited by the door, stiff with cold. Bishop rose, stretched, and revealed the long scar that ran across his back beneath the thick black and gold coat. The fur had grown back thin along that line, a pale seam under the darker saddle of his body. To strangers, it was the mark of an old injury. To Jonah, it was a map of survival. "Breakfast meeting," Jonah said. "Attendance mandatory." Bishop followed him the 3 steps to the tiny RV counter, where a dented kettle, A jar of instant coffee and half a loaf of bread made up the kingdom. Jonah poured kibble into Bishop's bowl first. The dog waited until Jonah pointed at it. "Still outrank me, huh?" Bishop began eating with quiet dignity. Jonah made coffee strong enough to make a spoon reconsider its life choices. He toasted bread in a pan because the RV's toaster had gone to its reward 2 weeks earlier. While the bread browned unevenly, he opened the small waterproof notebook that lived beside the sink. On one page were debts, written in tidy columns. Bank, storage unit, insurance, fuel, legal, veterinary. On another page were job leads, most of them crossed out. Dock repair, snow removal, part-time dispatcher, seasonal security. A man who had once guided aircraft through black weather and managed cargo routes across the Great Lakes now circled $10 an hour work with the seriousness of a general planning a campaign. That was the thing about falling. It did not always happen with a scream. Sometimes it happened in paperwork, a divorce decree, a loan adjustment, a business account emptied too cleverly to prove theft in a way the courts enjoyed, a partner's signature on documents Jonah had not fully understood until the money was gone and the blame had found his name first. Desmond Vale. Jonah did not say the name aloud. Names had weight. Some were stones in the pocket. He had met Desmond after leaving the Air Force, back when Jonah still believed discipline and decency could carry a man across any weather. They had built a small maritime equipment transport company together, moving specialized parts between ports, shipyards, and maintenance crews. Jonah knew routes, winds, lake behavior. Desmond knew investors, contracts, and the smiling language of men who shook hands while moving knives behind curtains. For a while, it worked. Then the shell companies appeared. Then the capital shifted. Then Desmond vanished behind clean legal walls, and Jonah was left with debt, ruined credit, and the ugly knowledge that being honest did not prevent a man from looking foolish. Bishop finished breakfast, nosed Jonah's knee, and stared at the toast. "No," Jonah said. The dog kept staring. "You're a decorated veteran." Bishop's eyes remained solemn. "Fine. One corner. For morale." He tore off a small piece and offered it. Bishop accepted like a bishop receiving tribute from a very disorganized parish. The laugh that escaped Jonah surprised him. It was small, but it warmed the RV more than the heater, which coughed twice and gave up. Later that morning, Jonah drove into town in an old pickup borrowed from a mechanic who accepted repair work as a form of currency. Bishop rode in the passenger seat, upright and watchful, his breath fogging the window. Jonah had planned to ask about part-time work at the harbor office. That was all. A practical errand in a practical life. But practical lives often change direction in rooms that smell like old paper. At the Merrill County Property Office, the heat was too high, the carpet too thin, and the fluorescent lights made every face look slightly accused. A bulletin board near the entrance listed tax auctions, estate notices, abandoned parcels, and municipal warnings printed in stern fonts. Jonah almost walked past it. Then he saw the photograph. The Larkspur Inn. A tall old building stood on a limestone bluff above the lake, its mansard roof sagging beneath snow, its porch wrapped around the front like tired arms. The picture was probably taken in summer, but Jonah could see winter on it anyway. He could see wind coming off the water, see the bluff cutting the weather, see the deep harbor line below. His fingers tightened around the coffee cup in his hand. He knew that stretch of shoreline. Years earlier, when he and Desmond had still been building legitimate routes, Jonah had studied the Merrow Bay reports. Lake depth, access roads, bluff stability, wind shelter, old service tunnels, former storage properties. The Larkspur had not mattered then. It had been one of many notes on a map, a dead hospitality property with awkward zoning and expensive repairs. But land did not need to be beautiful to be valuable. Sometimes it only needed to sit in the right place. "You interested in that headache?" The voice came from behind the counter. Nadine Crowell looked over the top of her glasses at him. She was a small woman in a gray sweater and camel-colored blazer, with a bob of yellow-gray hair and the expression of someone who had spent 30 years watching citizens fill out forms incorrectly. A red stamp sat near her right hand like a judge's hammer. Jonah glanced back at the notice. Depends on the size of the headache. The larkspur? Nadine gave a dry little hum. Large, historic, damp, expensive, possibly spiteful. Bishop, sitting beside Jonah's boot, lifted his head. Nadine peered down. That dog judging me? Usually, Jonah said. He's retired military. Standards are high. Mine too. She slid a folder from a stack and opened it. Property's been vacant for years. Roof damage, old plumbing, sealed wine cellar, bluff inspection overdue. Previous ownership tangled in probate and tax delinquency. Nobody wanted to touch it unless the county paid them to take it. Jonah stepped closer. But it's going to auction. Tax auction, yes. Starting bid is low because the repair estimates scare sensible people. I've never been accused of that recently. That earned him the briefest flicker of amusement. Nadine turned a page. Several companies tried to delay the auction. Different names, same sort of paperwork, missing signatures, shifting corporate addresses, incomplete attachments. Her mouth tightened. People think if they make a form confusing enough, the rules get tired and go home. Who were the companies? Nothing memorable. Maritime Consulting, Erosion Review, Property Preservation. One had a bird in the logo, I think, or maybe a weather vane. They blur after a while. Jonah felt something cold move through him, though the office was overheated. A bird in the logo. Not enough to mean anything. Too much to ignore. Bishop stood. It was not dramatic. He simply rose from the floor, his large body still, his head angled toward the folder as if paper could carry a scent. Jonah looked down at him, then back at the photograph of the inn on the bluff. For one moment, the room seemed to narrow around three things: the old building, the dog's sudden attention, and a memory of Desmond Vale smiling over a map. Jonah told himself not to be foolish. A man in debt could turn any coincidence into a prophecy if he was hungry enough. Still, he asked for the auction details. Nadine explained the process, the deposits, the risks, and the fact that buying a distressed historic property was not the same as buying a lottery ticket, despite what desperate men sometimes believed. Her voice was brisk, but not unkind. She had seen enough people make bad decisions in public buildings to know when to issue warnings without sounding like a sermon. Jonah listened. He took notes. He calculated what little he had left. It was a terrible idea. But terrible ideas came in different species. Some were reckless, some were necessary. Some were merely the last door in a hallway where every other door had already been locked. By late afternoon, the auction room held fewer people than the county had set out chairs for. A contractor looked over the packet and left before bidding began. A young couple whispered for 5 minutes, then shook their heads. A man in a good coat made one phone call, frowned, and disappeared. Jonah bid because no one else wanted to inherit the problems. When the gavel came down, it sounded less like victory than a small wooden cough. Nadine stamped the preliminary paperwork with a firm red thump. "Well," she said, handing him the folder, "congratulations, Mr. Bellamy. You now own a roof that dislikes weather, plumbing that dislikes civilization, and a cellar that has not improved anyone's mood in decades." "Sounds like family." "Don't touch the wine cellar until you've had the water lines checked," she added, suddenly more serious beneath the humor. "The larkspur doesn't have ghosts, no matter what the bakery crowd says. But that plumbing could make a living man wish he were one." Jonah nodded. Understood. Bishop looked up at him as if to ask whether he did, in fact, understand anything at all. Outside, the winter light had begun to soften. Snowflakes moved through the air, not falling so much as wandering. Jonah loaded the folder into the RV, secured the tarp again with numb fingers, and climbed behind the wheel. Bishop took his place in the passenger seat. For a while, Jonah did not start the engine. He sat with both hands on the wheel, staring through the windshield at the road that led up toward the bluff. A reasonable man would have walked away. A younger Jonah might have called the whole thing opportunity. The Jonah of this winter knew better. He had not bought a dream. He had bought a damaged building, a pile of liabilities, and maybe a few months before the next creditor letter found him. But beneath that truth, something else stirred. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too bright a word. This was smaller, rougher, like a match cupped against wind. Bishop leaned forward, eyes fixed on the white ridge beyond town. His ears lifted, the left one sharp, the right one tipped at the end. His body grew still in that old working dog way Jonah knew well. "What?" Jonah asked softly. Bishop did not look at him. The RV engine turned over with a reluctant growl. Jonah pulled out of the marina lot and drove through Merrow Bay, past the bakery window, past the gas station, past the red houses shining under their blankets of snow. The road climbed slowly, bending toward the limestone bluff where the Larkspur Inn waited above the frozen harbor. Jonah told himself he was going to inspect a bad investment. Beside him, Bishop sat like a sentry riding toward an old post, his amber eyes fixed on the bright white distance, as though some part of him had been called home by a place he had never seen. The Larkspur Inn did not look abandoned so much as offended. It stood on the limestone bluff above Lake Superior, with its mansard roof bowed under snow, its long porch sagging at one corner, and its narrow windows catching the winter sun as though it had every intention of remaining dignified, regardless of what time, weather, and unpaid taxes had done to it. Jonah Bellamy parked the RV near the old carriage entrance and sat for a moment with both hands still on the wheel. The inn rose before him like an old wooden ship trapped on land. Snow gathered along its railings in bright white ridges. Icicles hung from the eaves like glass organ pipes. The lake behind it flashed blue and silver, too beautiful to be trusted. Wind moved over the bluff and made the loose porch boards mutter among themselves. Bishop sat in the passenger seat, very still. "Well," Jonah said, looking up at the building, "there she is." The German shepherd's left ear stood sharp. The right one tipped slightly at the end, giving him the look of a stern officer who had heard disappointing news but was willing to continue the briefing. Jonah reached for his red and black flannel jacket, then checked the pocket of his faded cargo pants for his small metal compass. He did not need it to walk into an inn. He knew that. But his thumb found the dented lid anyway, rubbed once over the scratches, and stopped. Old habit. Old armor. He stepped out into the snow. The cold came at him clean and bright, filling his lungs with the mineral taste of the lake. Bishop jumped down after him, his paws sinking into the powder, his black and gold coat gleaming under the winter light. For a moment the dog lifted his head and sniffed toward the inn, not excited, not afraid, listening with his whole body. Jonah unlocked the front door. It took 2 shoulders and one muttered insult to persuade it open. The smell inside was wood dust, old varnish, cold stone, and something faintly sweet beneath it all, like dried apples forgotten in a cupboard. Jonah shone his flashlight across the entry hall. A wide staircase climbed to the 2nd floor. Wallpaper peeled in long strips from the walls. A cracked mirror hung above a narrow table, reflecting his own face back at him in pieces. Gray-blue eyes, short beard, tired jaw, a man who had bought more building than hope. "Inspection begins," he said. Bishop entered beside him, nails clicking on the floorboards. Jonah opened his waterproof notebook and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Front door swollen, entry floor uneven, stair rail loose, possible roof leak, east side. He tried to keep his mind narrow. That was safest. A roof was a roof, rot was rot. A number could be written beside each problem, and numbers, unlike people, did not smile while taking everything from you. But the Larkspur did not cooperate. Every room offered some small ambush of memory. In the parlor, dust lay over velvet chairs the color of old wine. A brass lamp leaned at an angle beside a stone fireplace. On the mantel, someone had left a bowl full of tarnished matchbooks from places with names like Duluth, Sault Ste. Marie, and Thunder Bay. In the hall, a row of hooks still held 2 forgotten scarves, stiff with age. Near the registration desk, a bell sat under a glass shade, green with patina. Jonah tapped it once. The sound rang out thin and bright. Bishop sneezed. Not a fan of hospitality? The dog gave him a look of grave patience, then moved on. The dining room waited at the rear of the inn, facing the lake through tall stained-glass windows. Several panes were cracked, but the morning sun still passed through them in bands of gold, violet, and watery blue. The colors fell across the warped floor like fragments of some old cathedral that had lost its congregation and kept the light anyway. Jonah stood there longer than he meant to. A chandelier hung above the room, its crystals cloudy but intact. Round tables had been pushed against the walls. On one of them lay a stack of brittle menus, printed in dark green ink. Whitefish chowder, roast chicken with winter herbs, apple dumplings, coffee, 5 cents. He almost smiled at that last one. 5-cent coffee. A myth from a Kinder Empire. Against the far wall stood a piano with a split bench and yellowed keys. Jonah walked over, lifted the fallboard, and pressed one note. The piano answered with a crooked, mournful sound, as if a goose had been asked to sing opera after a long illness. Bishop sneezed again, louder this time. Jonah laughed. It came out before he could stop it. Not a big laugh, not the sort of laugh that healed anything. But it was real, and in the empty dining room it seemed to surprise the inn as much as it surprised him. "Harsh critic," he said. The dog sat beside him, tail sweeping once across the dusty floor. Jonah wrote in his notebook, "Piano unsalvageable? Maybe." Then, after a pause, he crossed out the question mark and wrote, "Keep if possible." He did not know why. By noon he had found 3 leaks, 2 broken pipes, a raccoon nest in a linen closet, and one portrait of a man with a beard so aggressive it looked separately insured. He had also discovered that the view from the second-floor hallway was dangerous in a way no inspection report could capture. From there, Lake Superior filled the windows until the world seemed made of water, snow, and sky. A man could stand there and forget he owed money. That was exactly the sort of thing Jonah could not afford to forget. He was measuring a warped door frame when someone knocked below. "Mr. Bellamy?" a woman's voice called. "If you're alive, answer. If you're not, I'm keeping the bread." Jonah glanced at Bishop. Friendly town. He went down to find Winnie Ashford standing in the entry hall as if she had every legal right to be there. She was round-faced, rosy from the cold, with silver-brown hair pinned back in a loose bun and a wool coat the color of cranberry jam. In her gloved hands she carried a covered basket that smelled so strongly of cinnamon and apples it made the old inn seem to inhale. "You must be Jonah," she said. "Depends who's asking." "Winnie Ashford. I run the bakery on Cedar Street." "Which means I know everyone's business, but I add butter, so people forgive me." Bishop approached, measured and silent. Winnie looked down at him. "And this is?" "Bishop." "Well, Bishop, I brought apple cinnamon bread. Your man looks like he's been living on coffee and stubbornness, and only one of those is a food group." Jonah opened his mouth. Bishop sat. Winnie noticed. "Oh, he's the smart one." "Usually." She handed Jonah the basket and walked farther into the hall, looking around with an expression that softened but did not grow sentimental. "My husband and I used to come here for New Year's dinner, back when the dining room still had candles on every table and old Mr. Larkspur acted like he personally invented soup." "Larkspur was a person?" "Not originally. The family name was Harlan, but people called him Larkspur because he planted those blue flowers all along the bluff. Said the place needed a name prettier than his own. She nodded toward the dining room. After the war, he let men stay here who couldn't pay. Sailors, veterans, fellows who came home but didn't quite arrive. Jonah said nothing. Winnie's voice lowered, losing some of its bakery brightness. He used to say a warm bed could save a man better than a long speech. I think he was right. Most speeches are too long anyway. The sentence landed quietly. Jonah looked away first. Outside, wind moved against the windows. Inside, Bishop leaned his shoulder against Jonah's leg, a small pressure, nearly invisible to anyone who did not know the language of staying upright. Winnie did not pretend not to notice. She simply lifted the basket lid. Eat before the bread gets offended. That saved him. They stood in the old dining room sharing slices of warm apple cinnamon bread from a paper napkin. Bishop received one approved corner and one illegal crumb from Winnie, who claimed innocence with the smooth confidence of a career criminal. Jonah showed her the old menus. She laughed at the coffee price and told him her bakery would go out of business in 10 minutes if people still expected 5-cent anything. Then she pointed out where the Christmas tree used to stand, where the veterans played cards, where Mrs. Harlan kept a jar of peppermints for guests who pretended they were for children even when no children were present. By the time Winnie left, the inn had become less of a structure in Jonah's mind and more of a witness. That annoyed him. He preferred structures. A building could be repaired or condemned. A witness asked questions. In the afternoon, Deputy Arden Cole arrived in a brown winter jacket with a county badge clipped near the zipper and snow still clinging to his boots. He was not large like Jonah, but he had the compact steadiness of a man who had spent many years keeping his balance on wet decks. His black hair was cut short, touched with silver, and his eyes moved over a room before his feet committed to it. "Deputy Cole," he said, offering a hand. "Arden is fine unless I'm writing you a ticket." Jonah shook it. "Planning to?" "Depends what you do with this place." "Fair." Arden crouched slightly and offered the back of his hand to Bishop. The dog sniffed, considered him, then looked away. Arden took no offense. "That's a professional evaluation," Jonah said. "You passed enough to remain indoors." High praise. They walked through the inn together. Arden pointed out places where the floor might not be trustworthy, where the old radiators had probably frozen more than once, and where water damage near the back corridor suggested trouble deeper than wallpaper. He did not dramatize anything. He had the gift of making danger sound like maintenance, which somehow made Jonah listen more closely. When they reached the kitchen, Arden paused near a sealed door at the end of a narrow passage. "Wine cellar?" "That's what the county packet says." "Don't force it open yet." Arden tapped the frame with 2 knuckles. "This bluff has natural pockets through the limestone, old drainage cuts too. During Prohibition, half the lake towns had tunnels, rumors of tunnels, or drunk uncles who claimed they built tunnels." "Which category is this?" Arden glanced around the kitchen. "Could be all 3. The old stories say the Larkspur had a service passage down toward the water. Most of those were filled in or collapsed, but beautiful ground can hide ugly surprises." He said it plainly, not like a man telling ghost stories. Jonah thought of Nadine's folder. The company's trying to delay the auction, a bird in a logo. He looked at the sealed door, then at Bishop. The dog was not looking at the door. He was looking at the brick wall behind an old flower shelf. That night, Jonah brought a sleeping bag into a second-floor room where the window still latched, and the ceiling seemed less likely to express an opinion. He set a small space heater near the wall, laid Bishop's blanket beside his own, and tried to convince himself that sleeping inside a half-ruined inn was an upgrade from sleeping inside a half-ruined RV. Bishop disagreed. The dog stood in the doorway, looking down the hall. "Come on," Jonah said. "Penthouse suite, Lakeview. No extra charge." Bishop turned and walked away. Jonah followed him downstairs with a flashlight. He found the German shepherd lying in front of the old kitchen, body pointed toward the brick wall behind the flower shelf. Bishop's head was low, ears alert, nose working along a narrow line near the baseboards. Jonah crouched. Mice? Bishop did not wag, did not paw, did not whine. He rose, moved 3 feet to the left, sniffed again, and looked back at Jonah. Not a request. A report. Jonah shone the flashlight over the wall. Old brick, mortar cracked in places, a shelf coated in flower dust that had outlived the flower by several decades. Nothing dramatic, no hidden latch waiting for a hero, just a kitchen wall in a building that needed too many repairs. Could be damp, Jonah said, though he did not believe Bishop cared about damp. The dog lowered his nose again. Jonah stayed there longer than he meant to, one knee on the cold floor, listening. At first he heard only wind, the tick of the building settling, the distant push of the lake against ice. Then, very faintly, there came something else. A vibration. Not sound exactly. More like the memory of sound traveling through the floor. It stopped before he could name it. Jonah stood too fast. His hand had gone to the small compass in his pocket. He hated that. Hated the body's old betrayals. Hated how quickly a man could go from tired to alert, from cold to colder. Bishop stepped in front of him, not toward the wall, toward Jonah. The dog's body blocked his knees, forcing him to pause. Bishop looked up, amber eyes steady, scarred back rising and falling with slow breath. Jonah swallowed. "I know," he said quietly. "Not tonight." The next 2 days did not give him proof. They gave him irritation, which was often how proof began. A patch of brick behind the flower shelf felt warmer than the surrounding wall, though the inn's heat was off and the kitchen was cold enough to make breath visible. Near the baseboard, Jonah found a thin crust of white salt and dark grains of sand, the sort that belonged closer to the waterline than inside a kitchen sealed for years. Around midnight on the second night, Bishop woke from a dead sleep and stood facing the floor, listening. Jonah listened too. A faint tremor moved beneath the boards. Then nothing. He spent the next morning in the old manager's office, where file cabinets rusted under a portrait of Lake Superior in summer. Most of the drawers were empty or filled with useless receipts from years nobody remembered fondly. But in the bottom drawer, wrapped in oilcloth, he found a rolled set of building plans. The paper crackled when he opened it on the desk. The main floor was marked clearly: dining room, parlor, kitchen, pantry, office, stairs. The cellar layout was less clear. Lines stopped where they should have continued. A block beneath the kitchen had been shaded over in darker ink. Someone had written, "Storage area?" in a hand that did not match the original draftsman's neat lettering. Jonah bent closer. The change was not old enough. Or maybe it only looked that way because his mind had begun making weather out of dust. He carried the plans to the kitchen. Bishop followed at his side, silent. At the cellar door, Jonah reached for the knob. His fingers closed around cold metal. The room tilted, not physically, not enough for anyone watching to see. But inside him, some old instrument spun, a sealed space, bad air, no clear exit. The memory was not a picture. It was pressure, heat, a radio voice breaking apart, the helpless knowledge that training could not command every outcome. His hand trembled once. Bishop moved immediately. The German shepherd stepped between Jonah and the cellar door, broad chest against Jonah's shins. He did not bark. He did not pull. He simply planted himself there, solid as a command. Jonah stared down at him. "You're not afraid of the cellar," he said. Bishop held his gaze. Jonah let go of the knob. "No," he whispered. "You're afraid I'm going in wrong." The sentence made the cold room feel suddenly too intimate. Jonah backed away, sat heavily on an overturned crate, and pressed both hands over his face. Bishop came closer and rested his head on Jonah's knee. For a while, neither of them moved. Outside, sunlight poured over the snowfields and turned the windows bright. Inside the kitchen, an old inn waited with its small signs, patient as a riddle carved into stone. That afternoon, Jonah called Arden. He stood by the front desk with the building plans spread beneath one hand and Bishop sitting at his side. He did not raise his voice. He did not mention ghosts, smugglers, or memories of Desmond Vale. He only said the inn had a few things that did not match the drawings. Unusual warmth in a wall, sand where no sand belonged, a cellar layout that looked altered, and a dog with enough training to make Jonah reluctant to ignore him. Arden was quiet for a moment. "Did you open anything?" "No." "Good, don't." "That your official recommendation?" "That's my friendly one. The official version has more paperwork." Arden paused, and Jonah could hear wind on the other end of the line. "I'll come by again tomorrow. Until then, don't break walls, don't force the cellar, and don't let curiosity do your thinking." Jonah looked toward the kitchen. Bishop followed his gaze. "Understood," Jonah said. Arden gave a dry little laugh. "Old houses don't always hide ghosts, Jonah, but they're very good at hiding lawyers." The call ended. Jonah stood in the quiet lobby of the Larkspur Inn while the winter sun slipped lower over Lake Superior. The stained glass threw fading colors across the floorboards, gold, violet, blue. The building creaked around him, not like something haunted, but like something old turning in its sleep. Bishop rose and walked to the kitchen doorway. He did not enter. He only stood there, facing the brick wall beyond, waiting. Jonah closed his notebook, slid the compass back into his pocket, and told himself he would wait too. For one more night at least. The next morning, the Larkspur Inn looked almost innocent. Sunlight poured over the snowfields and flashed against the lake until the whole bluff seemed carved from silver. The old inn stood above it all, shabby and proud, its stained glass windows catching the day in broken colors. If a person saw it from the road, they might think it was only a forgotten landmark waiting for spring. Jonah Bellamy knew better now. He stood in the kitchen with his red and black flannel sleeves pushed to his forearms, studying the brick wall behind the flower shelf. His notebook lay open on the counter beside a flashlight, a tape measure, and the rolled building plans he had found in the manager's office. Bishop sat near the cellar door, not touching it, not staring at it, simply keeping himself between Jonah and anything Jonah might do too quickly. "Relax," Jonah said without looking down. "I promised Arden I wouldn't break anything." Bishop's left ear twitched. "I said I promised. I didn't say I enjoyed it." The dog gave a soft huff through his nose. Jonah touched the wall with the back of his hand. That same patch of brick held a faint warmth it had no right to hold. Not hot, not even truly warm, just different. In a house this cold, difference mattered. He had just made a note of it when tires hissed over wet snow outside. Bishop rose at once, not with panic, not with alarm, with the smooth, silent readiness of a creature that had spent years learning the difference between noise and arrival. Jonah stepped into the front hall as a black SUV stopped near the porch. It was too clean for the road up from Merrow Bay. Even the slush seemed reluctant to touch it. The driver's door opened and a man in a dark navy wool coat stepped out as though winter were a minor inconvenience arranged by someone below his pay grade. He was about 50, narrow-faced, smooth-shaven, with dark hair combed neatly back and thin-framed glasses that caught the sun. His shoes were polished black leather, entirely wrong for the muddy snow. In one gloved hand, he carried a hard-sided leather briefcase. The man looked up at the inn, smiled, then looked at Jonah. "Mr. Bellamy?" "That depends," Jonah said from the porch. "Are you here to fix plumbing or create it?" The man's smile adjusted by half an inch. "Lyle Sutter. I represent Corvain Maritime." The name entered the cold air gently. Jonah kept his face still. Bishop stood beside his boot, body quiet, eyes fixed on the stranger. Lyle climbed the porch steps carefully, avoiding a cracked board without appearing to look at it. "May I have a few minutes of your time?" "You drove up here in shoes that cost more than my heater," Jonah said. "I assume you didn't come for the view." "Not only the view." Inside, Lyle placed his briefcase on the registration desk with a precise click. The sound did not belong in the Larkspur. The old inn was made of creaks, wind, and tired wood. Lyle brought with him the colder music of conference rooms. He opened a folder and slid a document toward Jonah. Corvain Maritime has long-standing regional interests in shoreline preservation, winter access studies, and infrastructure support along the Great Lakes. We understand you recently acquired this property. The county did send me a few hundred pages confirming my poor judgment. Lyle's smile remained polite. The Larkspur sits on a sensitive bluff. There are erosion concerns, old drainage structures, and a lower access path that may be useful for seasonal maintenance. My client would like to purchase limited usage rights to the rear storage building and the lakeside descent. Limited usage rights. Precisely. Not ownership of the inn, merely access for survey crews, equipment staging, and winter drainage assessment. He said it so cleanly that the words nearly shined. Jonah read the first page, then the second. The offer was not merely generous, it was absurd. Not enough to make him rich. Enough to matter more than pride. Enough to repair the RV roof, pay down the bank, bring Bishop to the veterinarian without choosing between medicine and fuel. Enough to let Jonah leave Marrow Bay before the town learned how much of him was held together by flannel, coffee, and stubbornness. For one moment the numbers pulled at him like a warm room on a bitter night. Lyle watched without seeming to watch. "You would, of course, retain the main structure," he said. "This agreement could relieve you of certain liabilities while allowing our engineers to handle the difficult areas of the property. Quite beneficial for a new owner in your situation." Jonah looked up. "My situation?" "A distressed historic property is expensive. You are, I assume, considering your options." There it was, not an insult, nothing so crude. Just a soft finger pressed against a bruise. Jonah turned the page and saw the Corvain logo in the upper corner, a black bird perched on an anchor. For a second, the room vanished. He was years younger, sitting across from Desmond Vale in a small rented office that smelled of printer toner and ambition. A lake chart lay spread between them. Jonah had marked wind patterns, harbor depths, safe approaches. Desmond had leaned over the map, smiling, saying, "You see roots, Jonah? I see leverage. That's why we'll do well together." Jonah had laughed then. Trust had a way of making a man generous with his own future. Now, staring at the black bird and anchor, he felt the old humiliation rise with a heat sharper than anger. It was not only that Desmond had taken money. Money could be counted, cursed, chased. Desmond had taken Jonah's judgment and made it look foolish. He had turned friendship into evidence against him. Bishop shifted closer. Jonah folded the document closed. "I'll review it." "Of course," Lyle said, "though I should mention the offer is time-sensitive." "Most traps are." Lyle's eyes cooled, but only briefly. "I assure you, Mr. Bellamy, Corvain is interested in cooperation. And I'm interested in coffee that doesn't taste like road salt. We all have dreams." For the first time, Lyle's smile truly thinned. He gathered his papers, leaving Jonah with a copy. "I'll return later this week. You have my card." He placed it on the desk. The card was heavy, cream-colored, and expensive enough to annoy a man on principle. After Lyle left, Jonah stood in the lobby until the SUV disappeared down the snowy drive. He did not move until Bishop touched his knee with his nose. "I know," Jonah said quietly. too clean. By noon, Winnie Ashford knew a black SUV had visited the Larkspur because Merrow Bay possessed two efficient communication systems, cell phones, and retired people near windows. She arrived with a paper bag of rolls and the expression of a woman prepared to be useful before being invited. "Lawyer?" she asked. "Maritime representative." "That's worse. Lawyers at least admit they're lawyers." They stood in the dining room, where the stained glass laid blue and gold across the floor. Jonah showed her the offer. Winnie did not pretend to understand every clause, but she understood money offered too quickly. Her round face lost its bakery cheer. "That's a lot of zeros for a place with a roof that leaks in 3 languages. It would solve some problems." She folded the papers back exactly as she had found them. When someone offers too much for a house with a bad roof, they're not buying the roof. Jonah looked toward the kitchen. Winnie followed his gaze but did not ask the obvious question. That was one reason he was beginning to like her. She knew when curiosity should keep its coat on. A rumbling engine came up the drive an hour later, but this one had no polish at all. It belonged to an Orange County snowplow that had seen more winters than some churches. The driver parked crookedly, climbed down, and came in stamping snow from his boots. Otis Reeve was 64, compact and broad through the shoulders, with a red nose, a ragged gray beard, and a knit cap pulled low over a mostly bald head. He carried a dented red thermos under one arm like a sacred object. "Winnie said there was coffee," he announced. "I said Jonah had coffee," Winnie replied. Otis looked at Jonah. "That true? Technically? Bad? Professionally?" Otis grunted. "Good. If coffee tastes nice, it's dessert pretending to work." He accepted a cup, took one swallow, and nodded with grim approval. Winnie mentioned Corvain as casually as a woman dropping a match near dry grass. Otis frowned into his coffee. "Those fellows been up this road before." Jonah went still. "When?" "Storm nights, mostly. Last winter, maybe fall before that. Black trucks, sometimes a box trailer, said they were checking bluff erosion." Otis scratched his beard. "One of 'em parked sideways across the plow lane like he owned God's driveway." "You remember the vehicle?" Otis looked offended. "Son, I forget birthdays, appointments, and why I walked into rooms. I do not forget a truck that makes me reverse a plow, uphill in sleet." He gave Jonah 2 partial plate numbers and a description of the trailer hitch, the tires, and the whining sound one of the engines made in low gear. It was not formal evidence. It was better than rumor. By late afternoon, Arden arrived. He listened to Jonah, read the offer, examined the Corvain card, and said nothing for a full minute. Bishop sat beside him, watching everyone's hands. "This doesn't prove anything," Arden said at last. "No, but it's interesting. That police language for bad? That's police language for don't do anything stupid while I decide how bad." They returned to the kitchen together. Arden had brought a small inspection camera, the kind used for pipes and wall cavities. Jonah carefully removed part of the old flower shelf while Arden steadied the light. Winnie had been banished to the dining room for safety and responded by loudly reorganizing chairs no one had asked her to touch. Otis remained near the back door, claiming he was only there because the coffee pot was within range. Bishop stood at Jonah's left side, alert but controlled. They did not break the wall. They did not force the cellar. Jonah cut away a strip of rotted wood near the baseboard, loosened mortar that was already crumbling, and opened a gap no wider than a man's hand. Arden fed the camera through. The small screen showed darkness first, then brick, then empty space. Jonah leaned closer, the camera tilted downward, stone steps. Not many visible, just enough to change the temperature in the room. Nobody spoke. Even Winnie stopped moving chairs. Arden withdrew the camera slowly. Could be old service access. Jonah pointed the flashlight into the gap. Something pale was wedged between two bricks near the floor. He used pliers to pull it free. A broken strip of white plastic, about the length of his thumb. Stamped on it in blue ink was a partial shipping code and a tiny square pattern like a scan mark. It looked new. Too new. Arden took it with a gloved hand. That didn't fall out of prohibition. Bishop stepped forward and sniffed once. Then the German shepherd backed away, not frightened, but decisive. His ears flattened slightly, his body angled between Jonah and the wall. Arden noticed. So did he just vote no? He's trained to notice certain materials, Jonah said carefully, and certain packaging. Arden looked at the plastic again. His face changed, not dramatically, but enough. I'm calling someone. That someone arrived just after dusk, when the inn's windows had turned black, and the lake below reflected the last iron-colored light. Mara Ellison did not waste movement. She drove an unmarked government SUV, parked where she could see both the porch and the rear approach, and came inside carrying a compact field bag. She was 46, with dark hair tied low at the back of her neck, a weatherproof charcoal jacket, and eyes that measured before they judged. A small scar near her left eyebrow caught the lobby light when she turned. Arden introduced her simply. Mara Ellison, Coast Guard Investigative Service. Jonah offered his hand. She shook it firmly, then looked at Bishop. Retired working dog? Yes. Detection? Yes. She nodded once, not impressed, not dismissive. Good to know, not proof by itself. I didn't say it was. No, but people often want dogs to be magic when paperwork is slow. Jonah almost smiled. He's not magic. He's just usually right before I am. Mara reviewed the offer, the plastic strip, the photographs Jonah had taken of the wall, the altered plans, and Otis's vehicle notes. She asked precise questions. When had Jonah bought the property? Who knew he was here? What was his history with Desmond Vale? Did he have financial motive to create trouble for a company connected to a former associate? The questions were not kind, but they were fair. Still, Jonah felt each one like a small stone placed on his chest. So I'm a suspect now? He asked. Mara met his eyes. You're a man with debt, a personal grudge, and a new property that may contain evidence connected to an active investigation. That doesn't make you guilty. It means I don't get to be careless. Bishop moved closer to Jonah's leg. Jonah looked down at him, then back at Mara. Careless is how I got here. That answer seemed to matter more to her than any protest would have. She bagged the plastic strip, took her own photographs, and instructed Jonah not to remove anything else. She wanted vehicle logs, exterior photos, dates, times, and any additional markings they could document without disturbing the structure. We need light, she said, and patience. Fresh out of one, Jonah replied, running low on the other. Then borrow some from your dog. Bishop sneezed, as if declining responsibility for government work. By the time Mara and Arden left, the moon had risen over the lake. Winnie had gone back to town, promising soup tomorrow, whether Jonah deserved it or not. Otis rumbled away in the snowplow, muttering that federal people never appreciated good coffee. Jonah stood alone in the lobby, with Bishop and the Corvain offer still on the desk. The money waited there, clean and quiet. All he had to do was sign, and many of his problems would become smaller. Not gone, never gone, but smaller enough to breathe. He picked up Lyle's card. The black bird on the anchor stared back at him. Jonah tore nothing. He burned nothing. He was too old for gestures that solved only feelings. He set the card back down and wrote one word across the top copy of the offer. No? The following morning, Lyle Sutter returned. Jonah met him on the porch. The snow had hardened overnight, and the air was sharp enough to make every breath visible. Bishop stood at Jonah's side, silent as a carved guardian. "I assume you've had time to consider," Lyle said. "I have." "And?" "No." Lyle's expression barely shifted. "May I ask why?" "You may." The lawyer waited. Jonah did not continue. For a brief second, something almost human flickered behind Lyle's glasses. Irritation, perhaps, or calculation adjusting its coat. "My client will be disappointed. I've survived worse." Lyle closed his briefcase with that same precise click. He stepped down from the porch, then paused beside the black SUV and looked back at the larkspur. "Mr. Bellamy," he said, his voice soft as falling snow, "some old doors are best left closed." Jonah said nothing. Lyle opened the driver's door. "Especially," he added, "when they sit beneath a building with inadequate insurance." Then he smiled, got into the SUV, and drove away. Jonah watched until the black vehicle disappeared down the white road. Beside him, Bishop lowered his head and gave the porch boards 3 deliberate taps with his nails. Once, twice, 3 times. Jonah looked at the old inn behind him, at the stained glass catching morning light, at the snow-covered bluff and the lake shining like a blade under heaven. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I heard it too." Morning made the descent feel less foolish. That was what Jonah told himself anyway. Sunlight lay hard and bright across the snow outside the Larkspur Inn, turning the bluff white enough to hurt the eyes. From the dining room windows, Lake Superior looked clean and endless, a blue shield under a pale winter sky. It was the sort of morning that made secrets seem unlikely. Evil, Jonah thought, ought to prefer fog, midnight, and bad wallpaper. But daylight had its own cruelty. It showed everything. Mara Ellison arrived first, parking her government SUV where the trees partly hid it from the road. Arden Cole came 10 minutes later in his county vehicle. No lights, no hurry. Jonah had already cleared the kitchen floor around the brick wall, setting aside rotted boards, the old flower shelf, and a careful row of tools he had no intention of using unless Mara allowed it. Bishop stood near the kitchen door, scarred back level, ears alert, his body balanced between patience and readiness. Mara looked over the space once, then at Jonah. "We go slow. We document before we touch. If anything looks unstable, we come back with a structural crew." "Understood." "You say that like a man who means it for at least 10 minutes. Arden coughed into one glove. It might have been a laugh. Jonah did not argue. He had already learned that Mara distrusted drama, and in that he could almost respect her. Drama had cost him enough. Paperwork, photographs, measurements, those were less satisfying than breaking through a wall, but they had a better chance of standing up when men in clean coats began denying everything. They widened the gap behind the flower shelf by removing only what was already loose. Arden fed the inspection camera in again. Mara photographed each step. Jonah held the light and kept his breathing slow. Behind the brick was not a grand hidden doorway. It was a service cavity, narrow, cold, ugly, a forgotten seam between one century and another. Beyond it, a set of stone steps disappeared downward at a crooked angle, as though whoever built them had trusted gravity, but not geometry. The mortar around the opening had been patched more than once. Some of it was old and sandy. Some was newer, gray and hard, too clean for the age of the kitchen. Mara leaned close. "This was reopened," Jonah nodded. "Not recently enough to smell fresh, recently enough not to belong." Arden glanced at him. "That your professional opinion?" "That's my unpaid ruin owner opinion." "Still useful." They did not all squeeze in at once. Mara went first because she had the evidence bag, the camera, and the authority to tell everyone else not to be stupid. Arden followed. Jonah came behind with a flashlight and a coil of safety line over one shoulder. Bishop remained at the kitchen opening until Jonah looked back. "Stay." The German shepherd's eyes held his. "Stay?" Jonah repeated. softer. Bishop lowered himself reluctantly to the floor, head on his paws, but gaze fixed on the dark. The passage did not lead straight down to the lake like something from an adventure novel. It twisted through the bones of the inn. At first it followed an old drainage cut, brick-lined and damp in places. Then the brick gave way to natural limestone, pale and rippled, glittering faintly where the light struck mineral veins. A few yards farther, they found steel braces bolted into the rock, newer than the surrounding stone. That was what made it unsettling, not the old parts. Old secrets had manners. They rusted, crumbled, and smelled of dust. The new parts were the problem. Fresh conduit ran along the ceiling in a black protective sleeve. Small cameras were tucked into wooden boxes made to look like antique junction cases. A wheel track marked the floor where something had been rolled back and forth often enough to polish a path through grit. At one bend, a rusted iron hook hung from the wall, probably 100 years old. Beside it, fixed with stainless screws, was a modern motion sensor no bigger than a matchbox. Mara photographed both in the same frame. "The mask and the face," she murmured. Jonah heard her, though he wished he had not. They moved deeper. The air changed as they went. It grew colder and wetter, carrying the mineral breath of lake water through unseen cracks. Once, water tapped somewhere in the dark with the patient rhythm of a clock. Jonah kept his left hand near the wall, partly for balance, partly because enclosed spaces were better when the body knew where one boundary was. Arden noticed, but said nothing. That was one of his better qualities. At a low archway, Mara stopped. The beam of her flashlight found markings carved into the stone, arrows, initials, dates from the 1920s, and the rough outline of a bottle. Below them, someone had sprayed a small coated mark in dull gray paint. "Old tunnel," Arden said. "New traffic." Past the arch, the passage opened into a side chamber. It was not large, maybe 12 feet across, with a low ceiling and a work table made from marine plywood set on metal legs. Against one wall were waterproof storage cases. Against another, a charging station with battery packs stacked in clean rows. A laminated map lay under a plastic cover on the table. Mara raised one hand. "Nobody touch anything yet." For several minutes there was only the click of her camera and the quiet scratch of Arden writing notes. Jonah stood still, the flashlight in his hand growing damp from his palm. The map showed sections of the Great Lakes shoreline, small harbors, maintenance docks, seasonal closures, and narrow approach routes marked in different colors. Some symbols were ordinary enough: wind direction, depth estimates, ice warnings. Others had no place on a legal chart: coded initials, time windows, little black triangles along the waterline. Mara stared at the markings longer than she had stared at anything else. "These match something?" Arden asked. "Some of them." Her voice was careful now. "There's been an open inquiry into irregular cargo movement through smaller lake access points, weather events, low visibility, places that look too inconvenient for anyone to use on purpose." Jonah looked at the map. Too inconvenient. He almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. That was exactly how clever systems hid. Not in glamorous places, in annoying ones. Places normal people avoided because the road was bad, the dock was icy, the forms were tedious, and the coffee was terrible. He leaned closer. There were printed satellite images, too, tucked into a clear folder. Small harbors along both sides of the water. Private maintenance sheds, abandoned fish houses, seasonal ramps. Marrow Bay was circled, not in red, but in a muted pencil line a cautious man might overlook. The larkspur was marked with a small black bird. Jonah felt Bishop's absence suddenly, like a missing rail beside a drop. Arden opened one waterproof case while Mara filmed. Inside were sealed packets of documents, a ledger with abbreviated entries, and plastic tags printed with shipping codes similar to the broken strip from the kitchen wall. Another case held tools, gloves, spare camera lenses, and battery adapters. Nothing looked theatrical. That made it worse. There were no dramatic symbols, no villain's manifesto, no gleaming treasure, only the practical tidiness of people who had turned wrongdoing into routine. At the far end of the chamber, a narrower passage sloped downward. A faint mechanical smell drifted from it. Oil, wet metal, charged batteries. Mara checked the air monitor clipped to her bag. We continue another 20 yards, no farther if the floor drops. The passage descended through limestone where water had carved the rock into soft curves. The walls sweated cold. Steel plates had been laid over low spots, and rubber strips gave traction where the stone dipped. Then the passage widened. Jonah's flashlight found water first, black, still, and breathing faintly with the lake beyond. A concealed cave opened beneath the bluff, not large enough for boats in any traditional sense, but broad enough to serve a purpose for people who did not need comfort. A low floating dock had been bolted to the stone. Cables ran along the wall. On the platform rested a compact submersible transport unit. It was not a submarine, not the sort from movies, all shining curves and heroic danger. This thing was squat, dull, and ugly. A sealed hull about the size of a small utility trailer, with reinforced towing arms, battery housings, a camera dome, and a guidance module protected behind a scratched metal cage. Its paint had been chosen to disappear in dark water. A manufacturer's plate had been partly covered by a sticker from a shoreline survey company. Arden let out a low whistle. "That's not for checking erosion." "No," Mara said. Jonah stepped closer despite himself. He knew machines. He knew the language of function. This device had been built for one thing, moving sealed loads quietly through difficult water while weather and inconvenience did the hiding. It was crude, efficient, smart. Then he saw the navigation board mounted on the portable control station. His breath stopped. The board displayed route notes in a shorthand not printed by any manufacturer. Hand-added marks indicated crosswind corrections, ice drift, alternate approach angles, shallow hazards, and a method for timing movement between gust fronts. The notes were not copied exactly from him, but they had grown from him. Years ago, in a rented office with cheap blinds and too much coffee, Jonah had taught Desmond how to think about water the way pilots thought about air. He had explained that the lake was not flat. It had moods, corridors, traps. He had drawn examples of how to plan around visibility, wind, depth, and human laziness. He had believed he was teaching a partner how to run equipment safely. Desmond had listened. Desmond had learned. And then, somewhere along the way, he had turned Jonah's lessons into this. Jonah reached for the control station, then stopped short before touching it. His hand shook. Not much. Enough? Mara saw it immediately. "Step back." Jonah did not answer. "Mr. Bellamy." The formal tone cut through him. He stepped back. Mara's eyes narrowed. "What do you recognize?" Jonah looked at the marks, at the route lines, at the careful little corrections that felt like words stolen from his own mouth. "I taught him that." Arden looked from Jonah to Mara. "Taught who?" Mara asked. "Desmond Vale." Jonah's voice had gone flat. Not this operation. The principles. When we had the transport company. How to read lake movement like air movement. How to plan around weather. How to use bad visibility safely." Mara's face changed into something harder. "You didn't mention that level of technical overlap." "I didn't know there was overlap." "You expect me to believe you just found a system using your methods under a property you bought by chance?" The words struck cleanly because they were reasonable. Jonah almost preferred cruelty. Cruelty could be dismissed. Reason had hooks. Arden stepped in, not in front of Jonah, but beside him. "Mara, his background is exactly why he caught this. He knew the bluff mattered before any of us did. He knew the wall was wrong. He knew the markings weren't old. "That also makes him useful to someone else," Mara said. "I know," Arden replied, "but useful isn't the same as involved." Jonah stared at the black water. A part of him wanted to defend himself loudly, to stack his pain on the table until it became proof. But pain was not proof. Mara had already said as much, and she was right. From above, faint and distant, came the sound of Bishop barking once, not frantic, calling. Jonah closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, he turned to Mara. "You don't have to trust me because Desmond hurt me. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking you to test the evidence." Mara held his gaze. "I will." "Good. And until then, you do not touch this equipment without my say-so." "Also good." Arden's mouth twitched. "Progress." They documented the platform, the submersible transport unit, the charging cables, the navigation board, and the storage cases. Mara's efficiency returned, but something in the air had shifted. Jonah was no longer simply the distressed owner who had found something strange. He was part of the map now, whether he wanted to be or not. By the time they climbed back through the passage, Jonah's knees ached and his flannel smelled of limestone dust and cold water. Bishop was waiting at the kitchen opening, rigid with displeasure at having been excluded from history. The moment Jonah emerged, the dog came forward and planted one large paw on Jonah's boot, not leaning, holding. Jonah looked down. "I know," he whispered. "I stayed." Bishop kept his paw there another second, then released him. Upstairs, the inn had filled with winter light. It was strange to return from hidden water and steel into a kitchen where dust floated like flour in the sun. The world above had continued being ordinary. That felt almost rude. The next hours became a quiet machinery of confirmation. Winnie searched her memory and then her old bakery ledgers, because Winnie kept records of every donation, sponsorship, and town event with a seriousness normally reserved for scripture. Corvain Maritime, it turned out, had sponsored the Winter Lantern Walk twice under the category of Shoreline Safety Partner. Small money, public money, the sort that bought goodwill without attracting gratitude large enough to be studied. Otis sat at a dining room table with a pencil, a paper napkin, and a level of concentration that made his beard seem stern. He wrote down the nights he remembered Corvain vehicles coming up the bluff road, after heavy snow, before early thaw, once during a wind advisory when even gulls had the sense to stay quiet. He added partial plate numbers, trailer shapes, tire tracks, and one note that read, "Idiot parked sideways again." Nadine Crowell faxed and emailed what she could from the county office, then finally drove up in person because, as she put it, some files refused to behave unless supervised. She arrived in a camel coat, carrying green folders against her chest and looking personally offended by corporate confusion. Her review showed that several entities tied by mailing addresses and registered agents had tried to delay the Larkspur auction. Each attempt failed on small legal defects, missing signatures, expired authorizations, incomplete parcel references. They were trying to keep the property from transferring, she said, tapping one page with a red-painted fingernail. But they did it through too many little masks. Eventually, one mask forgot to sign for another mask. Winnie looked delighted. "Nadine, that's almost poetry." "It is not. It's clerical negligence." "Same thing in government." Nadine ignored her. Mara took copies of everything. As afternoon thinned into evening, the official shape of the situation began to form. Not enough for a public move. Enough for surveillance. Enough for careful coordination. Enough that Mara's voice, when she finally spoke to Jonah near the front desk, had lost its earlier edge, but not its caution. "We'll set up monitoring," she said. "Quietly. No confrontation. No heroics." "I don't own a cape." "Good. They're terrible for evidence preservation." Arden leaned against the desk. You should stay somewhere else for a few nights." Jonah looked at him. Mara added, "That is not a suggestion made for your pride. It's for safety. If Corvain suspects access has been documented, this building becomes a pressure point." The lobby seemed to listen. Jonah turned toward the dining room where the stained glass had begun to darken with dusk. He thought of Desmond in that old office, smiling over the map. He thought of the years since, the silence, the debt, the humiliation of trying to explain a betrayal that had been designed to look like his own failure. Desmond had won once because Jonah had been too stunned to stand still and speak clearly. He had retreated into lawyers, shame, and motion. He had let the story become too tangled for anyone to follow. Bishop moved beside him, shoulder brushing his leg. Jonah placed one hand on the dog's head. "I'm not trying to be brave," he said. Mara did not interrupt. "I know what brave men sound like when they're lying to themselves. I've been in rooms full of them." He looked at Arden, then at Mara. "I'm staying because if I leave, he gets to make this place empty again before the truth has a chance to settle." Mara studied him for a long moment. "You will follow instructions?" "Yes." "You will not go below without authorization?" "Yes." "You will answer your phone?" "If the signal allows." "Mr. Bellamy?" He nodded. "Yes." Outside, the winter evening drew blue shadows across the snow. The Larkspur Inn stood on its bluff, old boards creaking softly, its buried passages holding the cold breath of the lake. It had worn history like a shawl for 100 years. Now that shawl had been lifted, and beneath it lay wires, maps, batteries, water, and the fingerprints of men who believed every quiet place could be purchased. Jonah stood in the lobby with Bishop at his side and felt, for the first time in years, not healed and not safe, but placed. As if the long fall of his life had not ended in the snow by accident. As if it had brought him to the one map Desmond never expected him to read. By noon, the snow had begun to fall again, not heavily, but with the steady patience of a thing that knew it would win by evening. The Larkspur Inn stood on its bluff with its windows glowing faintly under a pearl-gray sky. Inside, the old dining room had become a kind of quiet command post. Mara had left 2 small cameras near the rear approach and one above the broken service door, hidden where old Trim and Shadow could forgive them. Arden had driven down toward town to check road access, promising to stay close enough to answer if Jonah called. "Close," Mara had said over the phone, "does not mean invisible. Do not improvise." Jonah had looked at Bishop after the call ended. "She thinks I'm dramatic." Bishop, lying beside the old piano, had thumped his tail once without lifting his head. "I have never been dramatic. I have been operationally expressive." The dog closed his eyes, unimpressed. For most of the morning, Jonah did what he had been told. He took photographs from outside. He wrote down times. He checked that the kitchen wall remained undisturbed. He did not go below. He did not touch the cellar door. He did not let his curiosity do the thinking, though it paced inside him like a wolf behind a fence. Then the vehicles came. Not one black SUV this time. 3. They climbed the snowy road in a neat line, tires whispering over packed ice. The first belonged to Lyle Sutter. The second was a white utility truck, marked with a blue-gray emblem of Corvain Maritime and the words Shoreline Assessment. The third was another SUV, darker, cleaner, and somehow more certain of itself than the others. Bishop stood before Jonah did. His body went still. His left ear sharpened, the right tipped slightly, but not from tiredness, from calculation. Jonah opened the front door before they could knock. Lyle Sutter stepped out of the first SUV with his leather briefcase and the same polished shoes, as if mud and slush were beneath legal notice. Behind him came 2 men in hard hats and winter jackets carrying rolled plans, clipboards, and tool cases that looked too new. They had the dull, careful faces of men paid not to be memorable. Then the rear door of the third SUV opened. Desmond Vale stepped into the snow. For a moment, Jonah did not move. Desmond was 54 now, but time had treated him like a favored client. His silver hair was combed back cleanly. His dark wool coat fit perfectly over a tailored suit. A gray scarf lay at his throat, soft and expensive. His face still carried the same handsome warmth Jonah remembered, the same bright ease of a man who could enter any room and make people believe the room had been waiting for him. Only the eyes had changed. Or perhaps Jonah had finally learned to see them. "JB," Desmond called, smiling as he came up the porch steps. "I wondered if the world had finally run out of places to hide you." The nickname landed harder than an insult. Jonah had not heard it in years. It belonged to airport diners, lake charts spread across motel tables, bad coffee before dawn, and two younger men who believed effort could make them kings of a small but honest world. Bishop moved half a step forward. Jonah rested one hand lightly on the dog's head. "Desmond." "No hug?" Desmond looked at Bishop. "Ah, new security." "Old friend." Desmond's smile did not falter. "Of course." Lyle cleared his throat gently, as if reminding everyone that warmth should remain billable. "Mr. Bellamy, given the recent snowfall and the documented instability of the bluff, Corvain has brought assessment personnel to inspect the lakeside drainage and retaining structures. This is a protective measure." "Protective of what?" "Your property," Lyle said. Desmond looked up at the inn. "And such a property it is. You always did have an eye for difficult routes." Jonah did not step aside. The two hard-hat men waited behind Lyle. Their tool cases hung at their sides. Bishop's nose moved once, low and deliberate. "I didn't authorize access," Jonah said. Lyle produced a folder. "The county has on-record prior easement review requests associated with shoreline maintenance. Corvain is prepared to assume liability for the inspection." "Prepared," Jonah said. "That word does a lot of work in your mouth." Desmond chuckled softly. "Still allergic to paperwork, I see." "I'm allergic to paperwork that arrives with 3 vehicles and a smile." For a second, the porch was very quiet, except for the snow tapping softly against coat sleeves. Desmond held up one hand. "Let's not freeze like 2 stubborn goats on a hill. We can talk inside. Your dog may supervise my moral decline if he feels qualified." Bishop did not blink. Jonah should have refused. He knew that, but Mara needed time, Arden needed positions, the cameras needed faces, and if Desmond had come in person, there was a reason. Jonah stepped back. "Dining room," he said. "Your people stay in the lobby." Lyle's mouth tightened. "Mr. Bellamy—" "Dining room," Jonah repeated. Desmond gave the smallest nod, and the others remained by the front desk. That obedience told Jonah more than any business card had. In the dining room, the stained glass windows scattered winter light across the floor in blue and violet shards. Desmond paused beneath them, looking around as though admiring a painting he had already purchased in his mind. "Beautiful," he said. "Wounded, but beautiful." Jonah stood near the piano. Bishop stood close at his left, one shoulder slightly ahead of Jonah's leg. "You didn't come here for architecture." "No." Desmond removed his gloves slowly. "I came because Lyle tells me you've become sentimental." "You drove all the way up here for that?" "For you? I might." The old ease in his voice was the cruelest thing about him. Desmond walked to the table where Jonah had once found the old menus. He touched one brittle page with a careful finger. "Do you remember Marquette? That diner by the ore dock? You drank coffee so strong the waitress asked if you were punishing yourself. You told her coffee was cheaper than therapy." And I was right. Jonah felt the memory try to open. He shut it. Desmond sighed, almost fondly. "We were good then. We were useful to each other. That's a colder revision." "It's a clearer one." Desmond turned. "You always did confuse disappointment with truth." The words were soft. They carried no raised voice, no visible threat. That was Desmond's gift. He could cut a man and make the wound sound like advice. Jonah looked at him and saw, not a monster, but something worse. A man who had sanded down his conscience one practical decision at a time until nothing rough remained. Desmond had not woken one morning transformed into a villain. He had simply made 1,000 clever choices and called each one necessary. "You know," Desmond said, "business was never your problem. Honor was. You kept trying to put it into contracts as if paper could hold a man's soul in place. Some men don't have enough soul to trouble the paper." Desmond smiled. "There he is." Bishop's body tightened. He did not growl. He did not bare his teeth. He simply moved closer, standing with his chest angled partly in front of Jonah. Desmond noticed. Of course he noticed. "You always liked loyal creatures," he said. "Maybe because people disappointed you." Jonah's hand rested on Bishop's neck. Beneath the thick fur, he felt the steady strength of the dog's body, the living warmth that had kept him from drifting through too many bad mornings. "Dogs don't need shell companies to hide their scent," Jonah said. For the first time, Desmond's smile touched something sharp. Above them, the inn creaked in the wind. Below them, faint and almost lost beneath the old floorboards, something began to hum. Jonah heard it because pilots hear changes before they understand them. Bishop heard it because his ears lifted at once, left sharp, right tipped, whole body turning not toward Desmond, but toward the kitchen. The hum deepened, not loud, not dramatic, mechanical. Jonah kept his face still. Desmond glanced down just briefly. Too briefly for an innocent man. There it was. The room, the polite conversation, the expensive scarf, the memories of bad coffee. All of it was cover. While Desmond stood under stained glass speaking of honor, someone beneath or behind the inn had started a machine. Jonah's phone buzzed once in his pocket, then lost signal before he could read the message. The limestone did what limestone did. It swallowed. Desmond continued as if nothing had changed. "You should have taken the offer, J.B. It was generous. It was nervous. It was practical. You always liked that word, because it survives." Desmond stepped closer to the window, letting the blue light fall across his coat. "Look at this place. The roof is failing. The plumbing is a lawsuit waiting for weather. The bluff is unstable. You are one inspection away from owning a headline." Jonah listened with only half his attention. In the lobby, one of the hard hat men spoke quietly. Another set of boots moved toward the back corridor. Lyle's voice followed, low and smooth, too calm. Bishop tugged once at Jonah's flannel cuff, not toward the kitchen, toward the stairs. Jonah looked down. Bishop tugged again, firm, then released him and stared up the staircase. For a second, Jonah did not understand. Then he saw the old building plans in his mind. Kitchen below the second-floor laundry, cellar line offset beneath the dining room, ventilation shaft drawn in a faint, narrow rectangle, the kind inspectors overlook because it is not a room and not a hallway. If the lower passage was being accessed, blocked, or flooded, the shaft might carry sound, air, signal, a way to locate what was happening without forcing the cellar. Desmond was watching him now. "Something wrong?" Desmond asked. "Just remembering why I hate old buildings? Yet you bought one." "I make rich, complex mistakes." Desmond laughed, warm as a hearth and just as capable of hiding ash. Jonah moved toward the dining room doorway. Bishop stayed glued to him. Lyle appeared in the lobby, holding papers. "Mr. Bellamy, my assessment personnel need to view the rear service access." "No?" "The bluff condition may present immediate risk." "Then step off my bluff." Lyle's expression hardened behind politeness. "You are creating avoidable liability." Put it in a Christmas card. Behind Lyle, one of the hard hat men had disappeared. Arden had to be outside somewhere. Mara, too, if her caution had not placed her farther back than Jonah needed. But the inn's thick stone and the fresh snow made the world feel wrapped in wool. Jonah could not count on a clean signal. He could not count on anyone hearing a half-sentence through static. He could count on Bishop. The dog's nose pointed up the stairs. Jonah turned as if to retrieve something from the second floor. Desmond's voice stopped him. "Jonah!" No nickname this time. That made him pause. Desmond stood beneath the stained glass light, older now, polished now, but for one strange moment Jonah could still see the man from years ago. Sleeves rolled up over maps, laughing at bad weather, promising that the future would reward men who worked hard and stayed sharp. "I did not ruin you," Desmond said quietly. "You ruined yourself by believing the game had rules just because you followed them." Jonah looked at him for a long breath. That should have enraged him. Instead, it saddened him, because Desmond believed it, not as an excuse, as a creed. Somewhere along the way, he had built a little altar to his own cleverness and sacrificed every decent thing on it, one signed document at a time. "No," Jonah said. "I followed rules because I wanted to recognize myself afterward." Desmond's eyes cooled. The hum beneath the floor shifted into a low vibration. From the kitchen came a faint metallic knock, then another. Jonah went up the stairs. Bishop moved ahead of him, fast but controlled. Not fleeing, leading. At the landing, the old hallway smelled of dust, cold plaster, and lake wind pushing through cracks. Bishop turned left, past rooms with peeling wallpaper and closed doors, straight toward the laundry room Jonah had barely inspected during his first walk-through. Behind him, voices rose in the lobby. Lyle, measured, annoyed. Desmond, calm, too calm. A door closed somewhere below with a heavy wooden thud. Jonah knew the sound. The cellar access. Locked? He reached the laundry room. The door was warped, swollen in its frame. Bishop planted himself before it and struck the wood with his nails. 3 times. Then stopped. Jonah grabbed the knob. Stuck? Bishop struck again. 3 times. Then stopped. The sound moved through the upper floor like an old bell, remembering its purpose. "Easy," Jonah whispered. But Bishop was not panicked. His eyes were fixed, his breath controlled, his scarred back rigid beneath his thick coat. He was reporting, commanding, reminding Jonah that the way down was no longer the way forward. Jonah pulled the small metal compass from his pocket, not because north mattered, but because touch did. His thumb found the dented lid. His breathing steadied. Below, the mechanical vibration continued. Water, he thought, pumps, drainage, a staged failure, clean enough for paperwork. He looked at the warped laundry room door, then at Bishop. "All right," Jonah said softly. "We do this slow." From downstairs, Desmond's voice floated upward, almost gentle. "JB, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Jonah did not answer. Bishop lifted one paw and tapped the laundry room door again. Once, twice, 3 times. The old inn seemed to hold its breath around them. Jonah Bellamy had spent half his life trusting open space. Sky above, instruments before him, horizon ahead. Even in bad weather, there had always been a shape to the world. Altitude, bearing, speed, fuel, wind. A man could be afraid in a cockpit and still know where he was. Now there was no sky. Only an old laundry room at the top of the Larkspur Inn, a warped door groaning on tired hinges, the low tremor of machinery somewhere beneath the floor, and Bishop striking the wood with his nails in that steady rhythm. Once, twice, 3 times. Jonah put one shoulder to the laundry room door and pushed. It gave an inch, then caught on swollen floorboards. Below them, Desmond Vale's voice floated up from the stairwell, calm as a man calling someone in for dinner. "JB, there's no need for theater?" Jonah did not answer. Theater was for men who wanted witnesses. He wanted a way through. He braced one boot against the frame and pushed again. The door burst inward with a cough of dust and a smell like cold plaster, old soap, and lake air that had been trapped too long. Bishop slipped in first, nose low, body tense. Jonah followed with his flashlight raised. The laundry room was narrow, cluttered with broken shelves, a rusted washtub, and a row of hooks along one wall. Snowlight came through a small cracked window, turning the dust silver. Bishop went straight to the far corner where wallpaper had bubbled away from the plaster. He sniffed along the seam, then tapped the wall 3 times. Jonah pulled away a strip of loose paneling. Behind it was darkness. Not a room, not a passage large enough for comfort. A ventilation shaft, narrow and vertical at first, then slanting down behind the wall. Cold air breathed through it, damp and mineral-rich, carrying the faint smell of lake water and electrical heat. Jonah closed his eyes and built the inn in his mind. Kitchen north, dining room west, cellar beneath and offset. Laundry shaft running down toward the old service cavity. Side chamber near the lower passage. Water cave farther toward the bluff. He could almost see it now, not as walls and rooms, but as a 3-dimensional chart. The old inn became airspace. The hidden tunnel became weather. The pumps below became a storm cell, moving where it should not. Bishop pushed his muzzle against Jonah's wrist. "I know," Jonah whispered. "Slow." That mattered. Panic loved narrow spaces. It filled them faster than water. Jonah took the coil of safety line from his shoulder, tied one end around the heavy iron radiator pipe, still bolted beneath the window, then tested the knot twice. He clipped the other end around his waist. He pulled a pencil from his vest pocket and marked the wall beside the shaft with an arrow. Not for anyone else, maybe. For himself. Marks mattered when the mind began to lie. His phone buzzed once. A weak bar appeared, vanished, then returned. He raised it near the cracked window and called Arden. Static answered first, then Arden's voice, broken but present. "Jonah, status." "Second floor laundry. Found the vent shaft. Mechanical vibration below. Possible pumps active. Cellar access may be locked." "Do not go." The line crackled. Jonah pressed the phone closer to the glass. "Signal bad. Bishop staying topside. I'll mark direction. Get eyes if I can. Tell Mara lower access may be active." "Jonah, wait for—" The call dropped. He looked at Bishop. The German shepherd stared back, amber eyes solemn, scarred, back rigid under his thick coat. "You're not going to like this part." Bishop gave one sharp bark. "Noted." Jonah clipped a small flashlight to his vest, took only what he needed, and eased into the shaft feet first. It was tight enough to scrape his shoulders, cold enough to bite through his shirt. Dust sifted around him. The old plaster pressed close on one side, stone on the other. Bishop could not follow. That was the worst part. At the opening, the dog lowered his head and breathed in Jonah's scent, then backed up just enough to keep watch. When Jonah slid farther down, Bishop barked once. The sound traveled through the shaft, not loud, but clean. A marker, a beacon. Jonah moved inch by inch. The shaft angled downward behind the walls, passing through pockets where the air changed temperature. He marked direction with chalk when he could. He listened between movements. The pump vibration grew clearer beneath him, a steady mechanical pulse like a false heartbeat inside the old inn. For a moment, the narrowness pressed too hard. His chest tightened. The past reached for him with familiar hands. Bad air, broken voices, the terrible sense of a space becoming smaller than a man's breath. Then Bishop barked above. Once. The sound cut through memory like a lighthouse beam. Jonah inhaled slowly. "Still here," he whispered, though no one could hear. Below, water splashed against stone. He followed the airflow, not the fear. That was the old rule. In a failing system, trust what moves. Air moved toward openings. Sound bent around chambers. Vibration traveled through structure. The inn was not a maze if he stopped thinking of it as a house. It was a body. And somewhere below, someone had cut into a vein. At a narrow bend, the shaft opened into a maintenance crawl space above the lower service passage. Jonah could not stand, but he could see through a broken grate. 2 men in corvane jackets were below near the technical chamber. One knelt by a portable pump. Another carried a waterproof case from the side room toward the lower passage. Water ran over the stone floor in a shallow sheet, glimmering under work lights. Cables had been pulled loose. A panel sparked once, then went dark. No shouting. No chaos. That frightened Jonah more. They were not panicking. They were cleaning. One man said, "Control board next, then open the lower drain." "Vale wants it looking structural," the other replied. Jonah took out his phone and filmed through the grate until the signal warning flashed again. He did not try to send it. Not yet. He saved it. Evidence first. Heroics last. He slid farther along the crawl space, following the sound of water toward the chamber where the submersible transport unit had been stored. The route narrowed, then dropped through a service hatch whose latch had rusted almost through. Jonah worked it slowly, jaw clenched, until it gave with a soft metallic pop. He lowered himself into the technical area. Cold water covered the soles of his boots. The submersible transport unit sat on its platform like a dark beetle beside the hidden water. Its guidance board was still connected to a portable power pack. The air smelled of wet stone, oil, and overheated wiring. Jonah approached the control station and forced himself not to rip anything loose. Desmond's men would destroy carelessly if it helped them. Jonah would not. He had spent too long being blamed for wreckage he did not make. He photographed the display. Route codes, timestamps, device logs, partial destination markers. He found the removable storage module beneath a protective plate and unscrewed it with shaking fingers, careful to keep the casing intact. Into his vest pocket it went, sealed in a plastic bag Mara had given him with the dry instruction. "For once in your life, label things." Above, Bishop barked again. This time the sound came farther away, carried down through the shaft and the walls. 3 barks. Pause. 3 barks. Jonah understood. The dog was making noise for others now. Outside, Mara and Arden were having their own battle with patience. They could see movement near the rear of the Larkspur, but the bluff path was risky under fresh snow, and the lower cave entrance had not yet been confirmed. A premature rush could send people into unstable ground or allow Corvain to claim they had simply been conducting emergency assessment work. Mara's face was carved from focus as she coordinated with the Coast Guard team moving in from the lakeside road. Then Otis Reeve arrived in his orange snowplow like an irritated saint of municipal inconvenience. He saw one Corvain SUV nosing toward the back road and swung the plow sideways across the lane with the confidence of a man who had spent 40 winters deciding where large machines were allowed to be. The driver honked. Otis leaned out his window with his red thermos in hand. "Road's closed!" "It isn't marked closed," the driver shouted. "It is now." Near the front walk, Winnie Ashford appeared carrying a metal coffee urn and a canvas bag of cups. No one had invited her. This had never stopped Winnie in any known season. A young Coast Guard officer stepped backward and crushed a row of sleeping lavender beneath the snow. Winnie pointed at him. "Young man, if you can preserve evidence, you can preserve perennials." The officer froze as if she outranked everybody. Arden, despite everything, laughed once. Inside the hidden chamber, Jonah looked for a way to signal the lower entrance. His phone showed no service. The radio hissed uselessly. Water was rising around the platform, not fast enough to sweep him away, but fast enough to remind him that old stone did not negotiate. Then he saw the conduit running along the wall toward a corroded brass panel. The foghorn system. He remembered the old maintenance note from the manager's office. Manual horn line, auxiliary power, lake-facing signal. The larkspur had once warned small boats away from the bluff in heavy weather. The system was old, but old systems had one virtue. They were built for stubborn men with cold hands. Jonah crossed to the panel, opened it, and found wires labeled in fading paint. He traced the line by flashlight, connected the auxiliary lead to the portable power pack, and prayed the inn still remembered how to speak. Nothing happened. "Come on," he whispered. He adjusted the contact, stripped corrosion with his pocket knife, and tried again. The first sound was not a blast. It was a wounded groan deep in the walls. Then the Larkspur Inn found its voice. The foghorn rolled out across the snow-covered bluff and over Lake Superior, vast and mournful like an ancient horn calling ships from the edge of myth. The sound shook dust from the beams. It moved through stone, water, glass, and winter air. Outside, Mara turned toward the lake. "There," she said. The Coast Guard team shifted at once, following the sound toward the concealed lower opening beneath the bluff. Arden relayed the position. Otis kept the rear road blocked. Winnie poured coffee with the fierce calm of a woman fueling a small war against nonsense. Below, Corvain's men froze. Jonah slipped back toward the service passage as voices rose around the hidden dock. Lights flashed at the cave entrance. Orders came sharp and controlled. Boots hit stone. Someone dropped a tool into the shallow water. No wild struggle followed, just the collapse of secrecy. The sort of men who relied on silence rarely looked impressive once everyone could see them. By the time Jonah climbed back through the maintenance route and reached the upper shaft, his clothes were wet to the knees, his hands scraped, his breath rough. Bishop met him at the laundry room opening with a sound Jonah had never heard from him before. Half bark, half reprimand, entirely deserved. "I know," Jonah said, rolling onto the floor. "Terrible plan. Good execution." Bishop pressed his head hard against Jonah's shoulder. Downstairs, Desmond was being escorted toward the front porch by Arden and 2 officers. His coat was still immaculate. That seemed unfair to Jonah. Some men could stand in the ruins of their own making and not even wrinkle. The snow had thickened. Blue evening gathered around the inn. At the rear road, Otis's plow blocked the way like a bright orange judgment. Mara stood near the lower slope, holding the sealed storage module Jonah had handed over, her expression unreadable, but no longer doubtful. Desmond saw Jonah on the porch. For the first time, his warmth was gone. "Well," Desmond said softly, "you found a way to be useful after all." Jonah leaned one hand on the porch rail. He was cold, wet and shaking, but he stood. Desmond's gaze dropped to Jonah's worn boots, his soaked cargo pants, his frayed flannel. "Still, JB, look at you. After all this, you're still a man with nothing." Bishop came through the open door behind Jonah and moved to his side, black and gold coat dusted with snow, scar across his back pale in the porch light. Jonah looked at the dog, then back at Desmond. "There are men who are empty because they were robbed," Jonah said. "And there are men who are empty because they never kept anything worth having." For once, Desmond had no ready answer. They led him down the steps. Jonah watched until the snow swallowed the shape of him among uniforms, vehicles, and blue-white light. Only then did his legs begin to fail. He sat on the top porch step beneath the yellow lamp. The foghorn's last vibration seemed to linger inside the bones of the inn. Snow fell softly, covering tire marks, footprints, old stains, and the edges of every hard thing. Bishop climbed onto the step beside him and rested his head against Jonah's shoulder. Jonah put an arm around the dog's neck. At first he thought the shaking came from cold, Then the first tear fell onto Bishop's fur. Jonah bowed his head. The sound that left him was not loud. It was not graceful. It was the sound of ice breaking on a lake after a winter too long to measure. He cried because he was tired, because he had been believed just enough, because Desmond had not taken everything, because Bishop was warm and solid beside him, because the larkspur, old and wounded and stubborn, had found its voice at the exact moment Jonah had almost lost his. The snow kept falling. The harbor below glowed faintly through the storm. And for the first time in years, Jonah Bellamy did not feel like a man running out of places to stand. By April, the Larkspur Inn had not become a miracle. It had become a construction site with better manners. Half the upstairs hallway was still covered in canvas tarps. The east roof needed more work than any honest roof had a right to need. The dining room floor complained every time Otis Reeve crossed it, which he did often and with no apology. 2 windows were still boarded from the inside, 1 radiator hissed like an offended cat, and a bucket sat beneath a ceiling stain in the parlor with a note taped to it in Winnie Ashford's handwriting. "Do not move. This bucket has a job." But 3 rooms were ready. 3. Jonah Bellamy stood in the upstairs hall one cold morning, hands in the pockets of his red and black flannel jacket, and looked through the open doors as if they were hangar bays before a first flight. Room 2 had a brass bed, a thick blue quilt, a reading lamp, and a window facing Lake Superior. Room 4 had a desk made from salvaged oak and a chair that Arden had repaired twice before declaring it stubborn but serviceable. Room 6 had fresh curtains, a small shelf of books, and a rug Winnie insisted was cheerful, though Jonah privately believed it looked like a garden had lost a fight with a paint store. They were not fancy rooms. They were warm. That mattered more. Bishop walked from doorway to doorway, inspecting each space with the grave authority of a retired officer reviewing barracks. His black and gold coat had grown glossy again, and the long, pale scar across his back showed only when the light fell a certain way. His right ear still tipped when he was tired. These days he was tired more often. The veterinarian said the old injury ached in damp weather, which described most of spring near Lake Superior. Jonah had used some of the reward money for that visit. He had felt strange doing it. For weeks after the investigation broke open, he had resisted the word reward as though it belonged to another man, one who had solved something neatly and stood smiling for photographs. Nothing had felt neat. Corvain Maritime had unfolded into more companies, more names, more ledgers, more men in conference rooms pretending not to know one another. Desmond Vale and his associates now faced the slow machinery of justice, which did not roar like a foghorn. It clicked, filed, stamped, postponed, and proceeded. Nadine Crowell respected that machinery the way some people respected weather. She had helped Jonah untangle the property records with a seriousness that bordered on holy war. Whenever another old form surfaced with an incorrect parcel reference or a suspicious company name, Nadine arrived with her green folders, red office stamp, and the expression of a woman prepared to defeat corruption through clerical accuracy. "They made the mistake of annoying the paperwork," she told Jonah one afternoon. "I thought paperwork annoyed people. Only amateurs think that." Her stamp hit the desk. Thump. Another small mask removed. Mara Ellison came twice in person after the arrests and several times by phone. She did not become sentimental. Jonah appreciated that. She connected him with a nonprofit program that offered short-term rest stays for veterans in rural communities, then warned him that applications, inspections, insurance, and safety compliance would test his character more thoroughly than any hidden passage. "Can I use you as a reference?" Jonah had asked. "You can use me as a witness that you follow instructions approximately 60% of the time." "That high?" "Bishop improves your average." Arden introduced Jonah to local support groups, volunteer repair crews, and a retired electrician who spoke only in weather complaints but could bring dead wiring back to life. Otis brought 2 carpenters, 1 plumber, 3 ladders, and his red thermos, which he claimed contained coffee, but which Jonah suspected might legally qualify as roofing tar. Winnie organized the Winter Lantern fundraiser, even though winter was loosening its grip by then, and the lanterns had to compete with muddy thaw. People came anyway. They filled the dining room with folding tables, donated tools, envelopes of cash, old quilts, canned soup, spare lamps, and enough baked goods to endanger the county. Winnie sold apple cinnamon bread, maple rolls, hand pies, and something she called Justice Squares. "What's in them?" Arden asked. "Sugar, butter, oats, and moral superiority." Otis ate 3 and said justice had a solid texture. Winnie looked around the crowded dining room that night, cheeks flushed, apron dusted with flour, and declared, "If the courts don't finish Corvain, cholesterol will." For the first time in months, laughter filled the Larkspur without sounding like it had wandered into the wrong building. Jonah stood near the old piano while people talked around him. He should have felt embarrassed by all the help. Part of him did. The old part. The part that believed needing help meant the world had caught him failing in public. Then Bishop leaned against his leg. Just once. A quiet correction. Jonah looked down at the dog and understood something he had resisted all his life. Being helped was not the same as being rescued by pity. Sometimes it was a town placing boards across a gap so one man could carry his own weight to the other side. He used the reward and support money carefully, not to buy back the old Jonah, not to prove Desmond had lost. He established a transparent fund with Nadine's help and Mara's dry insistence that every dollar have a name and a chair to sit in. Some paid for legal fees, some paid for insurance, some bought smoke alarms, fire extinguishers, clean mattresses, blankets, and locks that worked. Some went to Bishop's care because Winnie threatened to haunt Jonah in life, not death, if he tried to be noble at the dog's expense. Goodness, she told him, is not the same as stupidity. Don't mix them. Ruins the flavor. So the Larkspur became, not all at once, but board by board, form by form, meal by meal, something new. Its old name remained carved above the door, but beneath it, Jonah hung a temporary sign until Otis could finish the proper one. Larkspur Harbor House, rest stays for veterans. 3 rooms, open more, coming when the roof behaves. The roof did not behave, but it tried. There were nights when Jonah still slept badly. The wind came off the lake and found the cracks in the windows, making the inn hum and shudder. Sometimes that sound carried him back to failing engines, broken signals, bad weather, and the terrible helplessness of knowing that skill could not command every outcome. Sometimes he woke reaching for a control panel that was not there. Bishop always knew. The dog would rise from his blanket, stiff at first, then come to Jonah's bed and rest his muzzle against Jonah's hand. Not demanding, not worried in a way that made shame worse. Simply present. Jonah learned to breathe with the weight of that muzzle. In the RV, pain had lived with him like an unwanted tenant. It had sat at the tiny counter, slept near the broken heater, and read every debt letter over his shoulder. At the Larkspur, pain did not vanish. It became smaller because there was more room around it. A chair by the fireplace, a window over the lake, Winnie's bread cooling in the kitchen, Otis cursing at a pipe. Arden's boots by the door, Bishop's nails clicking softly down the hall, checking on rooms where no one yet slept. The first guest arrived on a morning after light snow. The world was white again, but softer now, edged with the promise of thaw. Lake Superior shone beyond the bluff, blue beneath a veil of mist. The air smelled of pine, cold water, and cinnamon from the kitchen, because Winnie had decided a guest could not be expected to trust a house that did not smell like someone cared. Jonah stood on the porch with the finished sign in his hands. Otis had carved it from dark wood and burned the letters deep enough to outlast weather and argument. Nadine had complained that the spacing was uneven. Otis had complained that letters were not supposed to be measured by people who owned too many paper clips. Winnie had told them both to hush because signs, like pies, were judged by whether they made people want to come closer. Jonah lifted it into place. Arden held the ladder steady. Mara, who had claimed she was only passing through, stood at the foot of the steps with a paper cup of coffee. Nadine watched from the porch rail, arms folded. Otis squinted at the sign like a sculptor expecting applause. Winnie wiped her hands on her apron and pretended not to be emotional. Bishop sat beside the door, chest high, scarred back straight, amber eyes on the road. Jonah stepped down and read the words aloud. Larkspur Harbor House, a free winter rest for veterans. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Otis cleared his throat. Letters are straight. Nadine frowned. Mostly? That's love language from her, Winnie whispered. A pickup turned slowly into the drive. It was old, blue, and carefully driven. A man in his late 60s stepped out with a canvas bag in one hand. He had a narrow face, silver hair under a wool cap, and the wary posture of someone used to apologizing for taking up space. He looked at the inn, then at the people on the porch, then at Bishop. Bishop rose. Jonah felt the old urge to ask questions. Name, history, branch, paperwork, wound, reason. The world loved making hurting people explain themselves before offering them a chair. He did not ask. The man climbed the steps slowly. I'm Earl Maddox, he said. They told me there might be a room. Jonah opened the door. Warm air moved out onto the porch, carrying the smell of coffee, apple cinnamon bread, old wood, and fresh paint. There is, Jonah said. Coffee's hot. Earl glanced at Bishop, who had sat again with great dignity beside the threshold. Jonah followed his gaze. And that dog will pretend he isn't asking for bread. Don't believe him. For the first time, Earl smiled. Not much. Enough. Bishop's tail swept once across the porch boards. Winnie disappeared into the kitchen, loudly announcing that no dog would receive baked goods under any circumstances, which fooled absolutely no one. Arden stepped aside. Mara looked out toward the lake. Nadine adjusted one corner of the sign because she could not help herself. Otis drank from his thermos and muttered that the porch still needed better bracing. Jonah watched Earl Maddox step inside. The Larkspur took him in without ceremony. No trumpets, no speeches, no miracle. Just a warm lobby, 3 ready rooms, a chair by the window, and a dog who understood silence. Snow brightened around Bishop's paws like scattered stardust. Above the door, the new sign held steady in the morning light. Beneath the bluff, the hidden tide still moved through old stone, but it no longer belonged to men who counted on darkness. The house had changed its oath. Once it had guarded secrets. Now it would guard rest. Jonah stood at the threshold, one hand on Bishop's head, and looked out over the harbor. He was not whole, not yet. Maybe no one ever became whole in the way stories like to promise. Maybe healing was less like becoming unbroken and more like learning which pieces could still hold light. Behind him, Earl laughed softly at something Winnie said in the kitchen. Bishop leaned into Jonah's leg. And the Larkspur Harbor House, old and scarred and stubborn beneath the snow, began its first morning as a home for those still learning how to return. Sometimes healing does not come as a grand miracle. Sometimes it comes as an old house with a leaking roof, a faithful dog at your side, and one small room made warm enough for someone else to rest. Jonah thought he had lost everything, but in the ruins, God still left him a door, a friend, and a purpose. And maybe that is grace, not always giving us back the life we had, but helping us build something kinder from what remains. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories of hope, loyalty, and second chances, please subscribe and stay with us for the next one. May peace find you gently, wherever you are rebuilding.